Goodnight Punpun is the best manga that I cannot recommend. What do I mean by that? Well, it's the story of me, and it's the story of you. It's a slice of life manga, but it's different from anything I've ever read. It shows the world as bleak as it truly is. It's not your standard happy-go-lucky slice of life. Rather, it shows precisely the same slices of life that you run to fiction to escape. It tells the story of Onodera Punpun, a kid who's trusting to a fault. His family has issues that he's too young to understand, and girls are confusing to him. He has friends, and they all do stupid stuff together, but as the story develops, Punpun does as well. The author, Inio Asano, portrays this kid in an unconventional way. While every character and panel is drawn with such incredible detail it'll blow your mind, Punpun and his family are drawn as these out-of-place cartoony birds. The reason Asano does this is because it allows the reader to put themselves in the shoes of Punpun and allows the reader to replace Punpun's family with their own. Now, of course, our lives and families are different from that of the Punyama family, right? Well, at one point in the story, Punpun feels the lowest he ever has, and it seems like he's only going lower. He had some truly horrific things happen to him, and he made some foolish mistakes. Because of this, Punpun spirals down a path of depression and nihilism, driving him to deal with his emotions in the worst ways possible. He was hurt by people, so in order to prevent that from happening again, he begins to hurt and manipulate people in the same way. Sound familiar? Well, it may not be something that you've experienced, but it's certainly something that I have. Every battle that Punpun goes through has some level of relatability for someone. Maybe it's not turning into the demons you've been fighting for 20 years, but instead it's questioning the reality of God, and what it means if he doesn't exist, or what it means if he does. Maybe it's as simple as getting your heart broken by a girl, someone you would do anything for, and allowing this person to hurt you over and over again just because you love them. Maybe it's as simple as looking into the mirror and thinking to yourself, is that what my face has always looked like? Punpun's unique art style allows the author to portray Punpun's emotion with how the character himself is drawn. Punpun will go from a small, innocent bird representing the innocent and naive mind he had as a child to a triangle floating through his day-to-day life, a triangle representing the simplest possible shape. The character viewing himself as a shell, nothing important, just as simple as the shape representing him, all the way to a black demonic figure with horns as Punpun finally accepts the monster he's become, knowing there's no redemption for him. Now, I don't want to travel too deep down the spoiler rabbit hole, but I want you to understand just how much emotion and character development the author is able to fit on a single page. The story of Punpun is a cautionary tale. Well, at least it was for me. It's a warning that we all have the ability to become a monster, but something keeps that monster at bay. And the panel that made me realize it was this. If we see shooting stars, what would you wish for, Punpun? Wishing upon shooting stars doesn't make them come true. Right, but what if? What would you wish for if they did? I would wish for shooting stars to disappear forever. A romantic moment ruined by Punpun's biggest fault, his worldview. Our worldview is our outlook on life. This is what allows us to keep moving forward, or it's the thing that prevents us. Punpun was hurt so tragically, and it changed his worldview into one that would make him wish that if he's not allowed to have a magical moment in his life, well, no one else should either. The characters in Goodnight Punpun are so well developed that you begin to see and understand the worldview, emotions, and perspectives of the people around him, and how those things affect their actions. Whether that's an old friend of Punpun being so incapable of dealing with the trauma in his life that he chooses to simply ignore it, deciding to live in a world where that traumatic event never happened as he tries to believe his mom back to life, despite reality being what it is. Or that character's friend whom he relies upon to protect him from reality, a kid who had to grow up all too young and see the world for what it truly is so that he can help his friend deal with the loss of his mother. Or even the insane cult leader that shows up randomly, believing that he's able to predict the future based on the vibrations going through the air. Punpun has one of the most tragic and skewed worldviews of the cast, and yet he's the character we follow the most. Now, I mentioned that panel and how Punpun's worldview affects his ability to even have fun with his girlfriend, but I want to pull back a little and get a bit more meta. I want to talk about Inio Asano's worldview, or at least the one he portrays in this manga. Inio Asano said that the end of Goodnight Punpun was designed to be the most tragic outcome for the character, but that wasn't the way that I interpreted it. Now, I believe that's because of a conflict of worldviews. I believe that you're able to live despite your mistakes and you are capable of being redeemed. You're not defined by the bad things that have happened to you, and you don't have to be defined by the bad things that you've done. Like I said earlier, I'm not going down the spoiler rabbit hole, but once again, I wanted to point out how worldviews affect your interpretation of, well, the world. The reason I said I can't recommend this manga is because of this issue of worldview. Not everyone has the same worldview as I do, and I can imagine that reading Goodnight Punpun might have negative effects for people who have struggled with depression, suicidal thoughts, have lost people in their lives, have been sexually assaulted, or have considered and or have hurt others. Now, despite struggling with depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and as someone who has hurt more people than I would like to admit, I decided to read Goodnight Punpun, and the Shooting Star panel I mentioned earlier stood out to me because it's the one that made me set the book down and think to myself, I'm so glad I don't think like that. Or at least I don't anymore. What I'm saying is that this manga is not for everyone. It's the bleakest form of media you will willingly put yourself through, and if you are capable of handling some of the more intense themes of the book, then go for it. It's one of the best stories I believe you will ever read or experience anywhere for that matter, but it will open up old and new wounds alike. It will make you think deeply about the person you are, and it will make you question who you are capable of becoming. Inevitably, you'll place yourself in the position of Punpun, and you will begin replacing the character with yourself, and that can mean appreciating your personal growth, realizing that in a lot of ways, Punpun represents the person you used to be, and sometimes it will mean seeing yourself, your present self, within Punpun. And if the results of those beliefs and actions are not something you want to see in your own life, then it can inspire change. If you'll bear with me, I would like to use my own experiences and beliefs to show you how Goodnight Punpun impacted me and how I interacted with the story. So first and foremost, I'm a Christian. It's a big part of who I am, and how I interpret and analyze stories is through the lens of that belief, but that was not always the case. I used to be an atheist, and it led me to a very nihilistic worldview. Now, I'm not trying to convert or push my beliefs on anyone. I just bring it up to tell you that I related to Punpun's hatred and disbelief in God in a way that I've never related to any character ever. And a lot of the things that Punpun thinks felt very familiar to me. And beyond my past belief and struggles, I also related a lot to Punpun's experiences. Not every single experience, but a lot of them. I've gone through my fair share of heartbreaks and betrayals, and I've spent a long time letting my anxiety and depressive episodes stop me from truly experiencing the blessings that life has to offer. It's tempting to give up and not push through those things and to let those things define you. And the story of Punpun is, at its simplest, a natural progression of one's life if they give themselves over to nihilism. For most people, nihilism reaches a point where the belief conflicts with their morality and the worldview kind of stagnates. Someone might believe something or look at the world in a certain way, but that person's morality prevents them from truly acting that worldview out. However, Punpun doesn't have the morals of a normal person. He allows nihilism to affect his view of other people. None of it matters, meaning nobody's life matters, and that leads to him doing some pretty horrific things. And Goodnight Punpun provides us with a bit of an ultimatum. Either Punpun's worldview is correct, and we can't blame him for the things he does, because he's right. Nobody's life matters. Or his worldview is incorrect, and his actions are rooted in a false worldview. a worldview that was cultivated by harmful environments and experiences, and an inability to deal with those things in a healthy way. He never really talks about the things he's gone through with anyone. He never goes to therapy, he ignores the advice of the people around him, and sticks more closely with people who will validate his thoughts and worldview. Punpun should be held responsible for the things he's done, but more importantly, at least more importantly for Punpun as a character, Punpun needs to find a way to forgive the people who have hurt him and forgive himself for the things he's done. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a Christian, and I find it ironic that the being that Punpun hates the most, other than himself, is the same one that I believe is the only way that forgiveness can truly be found. And while I don't believe it's an intended beat for the story because it's clear that God is a joke to Inio Asano, I didn't find it surprising that the further Punpun moved away from God, the more miserable he became. I don't want to offend anyone by implying that happiness is impossible to find without God, but I think I am willing to risk offending people by saying that peace is. And despite the clear theme of atheism within Goodnight Punpun, I think the story unintentionally shows this perfectly. The deeper you fall into moral relativism and nihilism, the more you'll find yourself drifting into an empty and unexplainable void. There's no explanation for the evil you've experienced, and there's no explanation for your existence or value. Therefore, there's no value in the lives of others, and we can treat people however we want. I'm not making these claims baselessly either. I've been down the road of nihilism. It is one of the darkest, saddest, and yet most tempting ideologies I've ever encountered. I honestly believe it's the only worldview that makes any actual sense besides the belief in God. Because if God doesn't exist, there isn't any hope. There's no point in living. The amount of pain you'll feel within your life far outweighs the amount of pleasure you'll feel, so you can't even lean on hedonism to numb that hopeless dread. Now, I'm sure this lengthy discussion of God is making some of you roll your eyes, and that's okay. I have no problems with people who disagree with me, but I do want to challenge you. Read Goodnight Punpun and tell me why any of the actions, statements, or beliefs of the main character are wrong. Feel free to disagree with me. I just want everyone to have a well thought out worldview. Why do other people have value? Do we have value ourselves? Where does morality come from? And do good and evil truly exist? Do we have any reason to actually stay alive? Goodnight Punpun laid these questions in front of me and made me figure out the answers. Being a Christian, I turned to the Bible and to God for the answers to these questions, but like I said, I'm not pushing my beliefs onto you. I'm merely explaining my experiences and beliefs. But having the answers to those types of questions is important. More important than people realize. Goodnight Punpun is a persuasive story, meaning it assumes the worldview it shows is the correct one and will try to convince you of that. And it can be convincing. But I would be willing to bet that an overwhelmingly vast majority of the people who read it fundamentally disagree with it, even if they don't know why. This video is not meant to be a persuasive essay, meaning I'm not trying to convince you that my worldview is correct. Of course, I believe that it is, but what I'm trying to convince you of is that a well-thought-out worldview that you can explain to yourself and others in a way that makes sense is important. In an ethics class I took at college, my professor said that the way to test your worldview is to push it to extreme hypotheticals, and I believe that's a good test. Goodnight Punpun is one of those extreme hypotheticals. As I mentioned before, it's a natural progression of nihilism all the way to its limits. Within the story, if we ascribe to Punpun's worldview, then Punpun does nothing wrong. His attempts to sexually assault someone, the several times he considers or actually does kill other people, the emotional manipulation he puts others through, his selfish suicide attempt, there's nothing wrong with any of it, because none of it matters. But ascribing to that worldview also means that nothing that happened to Punpun was wrong. The time he was sexually assaulted, the manipulation he went through, the death of someone close to him, or his abusive dad. The problem with nihilism is that while it attempts to explain away and cope with injustice, it doesn't remove the inherent feeling that we all have that injustice is wrong and that it matters. Because we all have an understanding that people have value, and whenever an injustice happens, We're upset because it's degrading and disrespecting that value. Nihilism is a hopeless worldview that, if given enough time to be taken to its logical conclusion, only ends one way. Develop a healthy worldview. Ask yourselves, why do other people have value and why do I have value? And give yourself time to honestly find the answer to that. I believe that each and every person is created in the image of God, and to do anything to disrespect that image is not only an attack against that particular person, or even oneself at times, but against God. You don't have to agree with that answer. I just feel this video wouldn't be complete without providing my answer to the very question that I posed. While Goodnight Punpun is a hopeless story about how dark and horrible life is, I believe there's still something to be learned from it. We can all relate to the struggles and experiences of Punpun in one way or another because life is hard and people suck. But if we allow ourselves to justify hurting others just because we've been hurt by others, then we'll find ourselves trapped in a horrific cycle that only ends in misery. So forgive each other, help each other, love each other. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I have one last challenge for you. Go make somebody's day.